My name is Hannah Brooks, and I'm 34 years old. The day after my grandfather's funeral, my parents called a family meeting and told me something that didn't make any sense. My father cleared his throat and said, "We've decided your grandfather would have wanted your inheritance to go to your brother, Mason. He needs it more than you do." I honestly thought he was joking. Grandpa had always believed in fairness. He treated every grandchild equally, and he'd spent years telling us that hard work should always be rewarded. But my parents had already made up their minds. They handed Mason an envelope containing a check for $180,000, the amount they claimed Grandpa had left for me. Everyone in the room applauded. My brother smiled awkwardly, saying he would put it to good use. I just sat there in complete silence. Nobody had asked for my opinion. Nobody had shown me the will. They simply expected me to accept that my inheritance had become my brother's overnight. My mother leaned over and squeezed my shoulder. "You're successful, Hannah. You have a good career. Mason's been struggling for years. Family helps family." I wanted to ask why family always seemed to mean my sacrifices and his rewards, but I already knew the answer. Ever since we were children, my parents believed Mason deserved second chances while I was expected to figure everything out on my own. I paid for college myself. I bought my first car myself. I worked 60-hour weeks to build a career in architecture. Mason quit 3 jobs in 5 years. Yet somehow he was always the one everyone needed to rescue. I looked around the room hoping someone, anyone, would tell me this wasn't right. No one did. Then just as I stood up to leave, Grandpa's oldest friend, Arthur Collins, quietly walked over to me. He slipped a small brass key into my hand and whispered one sentence that changed everything. "Your grandfather told me, if they ever give Hannah's inheritance away, tell her my real plan begins with this." I stared at the old brass key resting in my palm all the way home. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't attached to anything. Arthur had already left before I could ask another question. The only clue was a folded note wrapped around it in Grandpa's handwriting. "Trust no one until you open what this belongs to." That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I called the attorney who had handled Grandpa's estate, Daniel Harper. When I mentioned the brass key, he went completely silent. Then he asked one question. "Did Arthur Collins give it to you?" "Yes." Another pause. "Miss Brooks, can you come to my office this afternoon?" The moment I arrived, Daniel locked the conference room door behind us. He reached into a cabinet and placed a small black lockbox on the table. The brass key fit perfectly. Click. The lid slowly opened. Inside were 3 things: a handwritten letter, a flash drive, and another sealed envelope marked, "Open only if Hannah receives nothing." My hands began to shake. Daniel quietly explained, "Your grandfather made me promise not to interfere unless this exact situation happened." I unfolded the letter. "My dear Hannah, if you're reading this, then your parents have ignored my final wishes." A lump formed in my throat. Grandpa continued, "I know exactly why they would do it. They'll tell themselves Mason needs the money more. They'll call it helping family. But helping one child by stealing from another has never been fairness." Every sentence felt like he had predicted this day years in advance. Then came the part that stunned me. "The money in my will was never your true inheritance." I looked up at Daniel. "What does that mean?" He smiled slightly. "Keep reading. 6 years ago, I quietly invested in Brooks Industrial Holdings, the company where I spent 30 years as an engineer. Those shares were placed into a private trust that belongs to you alone." Daniel slowly slid another folder across the table. Inside was the trust agreement. Current estimated value, $2.8 million. I couldn't breathe. I looked at Daniel in disbelief. "My parents, they don't know?" He slowly shook his head. "No. They only knew about the cash inheritance. They never knew your grandfather created a completely separate trust." Then he handed me the sealed envelope. Across the front, Grandpa had written, "Open this in front of your parents after they celebrate giving your inheritance away." I smiled for the first time since the funeral. Maybe Grandpa hadn't lost after all. Maybe he'd planned for this from the very beginning. 2 nights later, my parents invited the entire family over for what my mother called a celebration of Grandpa's legacy. I almost laughed when I heard those words. The one person whose legacy they had ignored was Grandpa himself. Mason was sitting at the head of the dining table, proudly talking about the new truck he planned to buy with his inheritance. My parents looked happier than I'd seen them in years. Every relative believed Grandpa had intentionally left Mason the larger gift because he needed help. No one knew the truth. Dinner ended with my father raising a glass. I'm proud that our family came together and did what was right. That was my moment. I stood up calmly and placed Grandpa's sealed envelope in the middle of the table. My attorney asked me to give you this. My father frowned. What is it? It's Grandpa's backup plan. The room went completely quiet. My mother slowly opened the envelope. Inside was another handwritten letter. She began reading aloud. Richard and Elaine, if you're opening this letter, then you've already given Hannah's inheritance to Mason. Her voice immediately started shaking. I knew you might convince yourselves that stealing from one child to reward another was somehow an act of love. It isn't. It's favoritism wearing the mask of kindness. Nobody moved. Grandpa continued. Mason is my grandson and I love him. But Hannah earned every opportunity she has through discipline, sacrifice, and honesty. If you've ignored my wishes, then you've taught both of your children the wrong lesson. My father quietly lowered his head. Then my mother unfolded the final page. The cash inheritance was only a test. Hannah's true inheritance has always been protected in a separate trust that none of you could touch. Every face around the table turned toward me. I calmly placed the trust documents beside Grandpa's letter. Daniel Harper had prepared certified copies. To 8 million? My aunt whispered. My brother stared at me in disbelief. My father looked like the color had drained from his face. My mother whispered, This can't be real. It is, I replied quietly. The attorney confirmed everything yesterday. Then Grandpa's final paragraph was read aloud. If you're reading this, then Hannah already knows the truth. The money isn't the lesson. The lesson is this. The child who is always expected to sacrifice eventually learns who truly values them. The room fell silent. Even Mason looked embarrassed. He slowly pushed the check across the table toward me. I didn't know, he said quietly. I thought Grandpa changed his mind. I looked at him for a long moment. For the first time in years, I realized the biggest betrayal hadn't come from my brother. It had come from the two people who were supposed to protect us both. Nobody spoke for nearly a full minute. The silence felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. My father kept reading Grandpa's letter over and over as if the words might somehow change. They didn't. My mother quietly wiped away tears. But they weren't enough to erase what she'd done. For years, she'd asked me to understand, to compromise, to be the bigger person. Yet somehow, being the bigger person had always meant giving up something that belonged to me. My father finally looked at me. Hannah, we made a terrible mistake. I shook my head gently. No, you made a choice. There's a difference. Those words hit harder than I expected. My mother reached across the table. We can fix this. I smiled sadly. The money was never what needed fixing. It was trust. She couldn't answer that. Then Mason stood up. He slid the inheritance check back toward our parents. I don't want it. Everyone looked at him. If Grandpa wanted Hannah to have it, then it was never mine. I should have asked questions instead of accepting it. For the first time in years, I saw my younger brother acting like the man Grandpa always believed he could become. Our father quietly took the check. I'll return every dollar. I nodded. That's between you and Grandpa's estate. It won't change what happened. A week later, the attorney finalized everything. The cash inheritance was restored to me exactly as Grandpa intended. The private trust remained untouched in my name. But the biggest surprise came a month later. My parents asked if I would come to dinner. Not for a celebration, not for a holiday. Just to talk. My father apologized without making excuses. My mother admitted she had spent years protecting Mason because she was afraid he would fail, while assuming I would always be strong enough to survive on my own. Then she said something I'll never forget.